There's a story I heard once about a man who spent his whole life building a mansion by a raging river. He poured every brick, every nail, every dime into that house, convinced it was the only thing that would make him safe, make him happy. He stood on the porch, proud, watching the water roar, never noticing the little saplings he'd planted years ago, the ones that were supposed to grow into a protective forest, were withering from neglect. He was too busy adding another room, another tower, until one day the river rose, and the foundations he'd laid so carefully began to crack, while the trees he'd forgotten were long gone. That man could have been Garrett back when the story started. Not that he'd ever admit it. Garrett, he's 48 now, a construction worker, mostly foreman these days, though he still loves the feel of a hammer in his hand, the smell of fresh-cut lumber. You wouldn't pick him out of a crowd for anything special, not at first glance anyway. Just another working man. He stands maybe 6 feet, built solid, not fat, not lean, just strong, the kind of strength you earn by hoisting steel beams and pouring concrete for decades, not from a gym. His hair, what's left of it, is a salt and pepper buzz cut that never quite sits flat. There are lines etched around his eyes, like old maps, telling you he's seen more sunrises than he'd care to count, and plenty of sunsets he barely noticed. His face usually wears a quiet sort of patience, but sometimes, when he thinks no one's watching, you catch a flash of something deeper, a weariness that goes bone deep. It's in his hands, too. Knuckles thick and scarred, skin like old leather, the nails always a little rough, no matter how much he scrubs them. Those hands have built things, broken things, held things tight, and let things go. They're the hands of a man who knows how to work, how to fix, how to endure. When he talks, which isn't often, his voice is low, gravelly, like stones shifting at the bottom of a riverbed. He doesn't waste words. He listens. He watches. He's the guy who sees everything but says nothing unless it needs saying, and then he'll cut straight to it, no fancy talk. You get the feeling he prefers the company of tools and blueprints to most people. He's seen enough of both to know where they stand. But if you watch him long enough, you might notice the way he glances at the younger guys on the crew, a flicker of something almost wistful in those tired eyes. A man who carries the weight of a past he doesn't talk about, but which shapes every slow, deliberate move he makes today. He carries it like a tool belt, heavy but essential. There was a time, not so long ago, when folks believed the most valuable thing you could build was a fortune, a towering empire of your own making. They thought happiness was a prize you could win, tucked away at the end of a long, hard race. And a man, well, a man was only worth the sum of what he owned, or what he could control. Many chased that finish line, eyes fixed on the distant glitter, never once looking down at the ground beneath their feet or the hands reaching out beside them. They ran hard until they were spent, and often until they were broken. Until one day they woke up, sometimes literally flat on their back, wondering what in the hell they'd been chasing and what exactly they'd found. Garrett, at 48, working construction, was one of those men. He still hauled beams and poured concrete, still built things with his calloused hands, just not the kind. He used to build an empire, or at least that's what he called his small construction firm. He'd envisioned it sprawling, growing, a testament to his drive, his worth. Now he built for someone else on someone else's schedule, someone else's dream. Every beam he hoisted, every nail he hammered, it wasn't his name going on the sign, wasn't his legacy rising from the dust. The alarm clock, set for 5:00 a.m., was less a wake-up call and more a daily reminder of the unforgiving rhythm of his existence. Screeched, an insistent digital whine in the pre-dawn dark of his modest, slightly worn home. The house itself, a single-family rambler in a working-class suburb, was well-maintained, the lawn neatly cut, the gutters clean, but it showed its age just like him. He'd painted the trim himself a few years back, patched the roof twice. Small, necessary victories against entropy. He moved through the quiet house like a shadow, the floorboards groaning under his weight, a familiar complaint. Coffee first. Always coffee, black, strong enough to stand a spoon in. He'd sit at the kitchen table, the only light from the dim overhead bulb, staring at the muted glow of the street lamp through the window. It was a time of quiet reflection, or perhaps quiet dread. A moment to mentally list the day's tasks, to brace for the cold bite of the morning air, the familiar ache in his lower back. The drive to the site was a blur of highway lights and tailpipes, another anonymous face among the thousands heading to their own grind. He'd listen to the morning news, the endless cycle of problems he couldn't fix, or sometimes an old rock station, the familiar chords a dull comfort. His hands, gnarled and thick-fingered from years of labor, gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. They were the hands of a man who worked, who built, who fixed. But once they were also the hands that signed contracts, drew up plans, shook on deals that promised a bigger, brighter future. At the sight, the rhythm took over. The clang of steel, the roar of machinery, the shouts of men over the din. Garrett was in his element here physically. He knew the work. He knew how to read a blueprint, how to cut a perfect joist, how to pour concrete so it wouldn't crack. He was reliable, steady, a rock. The younger guys respected him, even if they sometimes found him a little remote. He'd bark orders when needed, offer a quiet correction, but mostly he kept to himself. The sweat, the dust, the fatigue, it was a different kind of pain than the one that settled in his chest, a dull, constant throb beneath his ribs. This pain he understood. This pain he could push through. Evenings were a quiet affair. He'd eat dinner alone, usually something simple he'd thrown together or leftovers from the grocery store deli. The TV would be on, a sports game or a documentary, the sound low, just enough to fill the empty space. He'd call his kids, Emily and David, dutifully. Emily, 22, was away at college, her voice bright, distant. David, 19, working, more laconic, still finding his feet. The conversations were always polite, a series of questions and short answers, circling the edges of their lives without truly touching. He'd ask about classes, about work, about their plans. They'd ask if he was doing okay, always okay, never truly honest. The silence after he hung up was always louder. The stack of bills on the kitchen counter never seemed to shrink. Mortgage, utilities, child support for Sarah, Emily's tuition. He tracked every penny, every incoming and outgoing, his old business ledgers still ingrained in his mind, though now the numbers were far smaller, the margins tighter. It wasn't poverty, not really, but it was a constant, gnawing pressure, a reminder of how close he always was to falling behind. The gnawing pressure, a reminder of how close he always was to falling behind. The fear wasn't about losing the house. It was about losing himself again, losing the last shreds of what he'd worked for. A fear born of a deeper, more profound collapse that had already happened. His construction business, Garrett Builders, had been his lifeblood. For years, he'd built it from scratch, brick by brick, sweat by sweat. He'd seen it as his legacy, proof of his worth, a monument to the relentless drive he'd inherited from a father who always said a man's value was in what he provided. He'd worked 18-hour days, missed anniversaries, little league games, school plays. He told himself it was for them, for Sarah, for Emily and David, so they wouldn't want for anything. He bought the big house, the nice cars, paid for the best schools. He provided, he controlled, and he watched it all crumble. The market shifted slowly at first, then like a landslide. Projects dried up, financing tightened. He made bad bets, stubborn in his belief that he could outwork any downturn, outsmart any trend. He saw every setback as a challenge to conquer, not a sign to adapt. The accounts dwindled, the phone stopped ringing. He laid off men he'd worked with for years, men who'd trusted him, their faces a mirror of his own failing hope. The final papers, when they came, felt like a death certificate. He signed them in a lawyer's office, the air thick with the smell of old paper and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights. It wasn't just a business he lost, it was the foundation of who he thought he was. Sarah had seen it coming. She'd tried to talk to him, to tell him he was working himself into the ground, that they were losing him, not just money. But he'd brushed her off, saw her concerns as distractions, weaknesses. His obsession with pulling the business back from the brink consumed him, leaving no room for her, for them. Their marriage didn't end with a bang, but with a whimper, a slow, inevitable fading. After the business was gone, there was nothing left to distract from the chasm between them. One quiet evening after dinner, she simply said, "Garrett, I can't do this anymore. I don't even know who you are now." He hadn't fought her. He hadn't known what to say. His silence, his emotional distance had done its work. The papers were signed, final and clinical, just like the business. He watched her drive away, the taillights disappearing down the street, and felt a profound emptiness that even the ghosts of his ambition couldn't fill. He tried to rebuild piece by piece, taking the general construction jobs, the grunt work, anything to keep moving. He pushed through the shame, the quiet whispers he imagined from old colleagues. But the real breaking point, the one that cracked him wide open, came on a cold Tuesday morning on a downtown job site. He was directing a crane operator, moving a heavy steel beam into place. The air was crisp, the sky a dull gray. He'd done this 1,000 times. He'd checked the rigging, double-checked the signals. But a frayed cable hidden from view chose that moment to give way. There was a sickening groan, a snap that echoed even over the roar of the city. Time seemed to warp. The beam, an industrial beast weighing hundreds of pounds, twisted, pivoted, and began its terrifying descent. Garrett, standing just below, saw it happen. He saw the glint of the cold steel, the sudden, impossible speed. He heard the shouts, the panicked cries, distant, distorted. He didn't have time to move, only to register a flash of impossible, brutal light, a split-second understanding that this was it. A cold, hard certainty. Then a blinding pain. Not a sharp, focused pain, but an all-encompassing, bone-crushing force that slammed into his side, throwing him against a stack of plywood sheets with a sickening thud. The world went white, then black, then a dizzying, kaleidoscopic blur of red and gray. He lay there, gasping, a searing agony in his ribs, the taste of dust and blood in his mouth. Men were shouting, rushing towards him. A warm wetness spread beneath him. He looked up at the gray sky, through the swirling dust, and saw the crane operator, his face pale with terror, leaning out of his cab, pointing. The beam lay next to him, a silent, deadly reminder of how close he'd come. So incredibly close. Lying in the sterile, too-bright hospital bed, the heavy pain medication a dull fog in his brain, the silence was deafening. He stared at the water-stained acoustic tiles on the ceiling. Each breath was a shallow, guarded intake of air, a painful reminder of the cracked ribs, the bruised lung. The fear wasn't about dying anymore. It was about what he'd almost died for. It was 3 a.m. The hospital wing was quiet, punctuated only by the distant beeping of machines and the hushed footsteps of a nurse. Garrett was awake, the meds wearing off, leaving him exposed to the raw ache in his body and the even deeper ache in his soul. He was alone, truly alone. The memories came in a relentless, unforgiving wave. The proud day he opened Garrett Builders, the hopeful plans he and Sarah had made, the sound of his kids' laughter. It all felt like another lifetime, another man. He had chased wealth, success, power, believing it was the only way to earn respect, to secure his future, to make himself mean something. He had built an empire of dust, trading family dinners for late nights, genuine connection for a fat bank account. And where had it gotten him? Flat on his back, almost dead, a single man in a sterile room with an ex-wife who didn't know him and kids who kept him at arm's length. He thought of Emily, her college tuition a heavy burden, but their conversations so light, so superficial. He thought of David, working, trying to find his own way, probably making the same mistakes Garrett had because Garrett hadn't been there to teach him anything else. He hadn't been a father, he'd been a provider. He hadn't been a husband, he'd been a landlord in his own home. A tear, hot and unexpected, traced a path down his temple, pooling in his ear. He didn't wipe it away. What a fool he'd been. He'd built walls where he should have built bridges. He'd mistaken control for connection, material goods for true worth. He had poured every ounce of his energy into chasing something external, something fleeting, and in doing so, he had lost everything that actually mattered. He had lost his business, yes. He had lost his marriage, yes. He had nearly lost his life. But what he realized, lying there in the brutal honesty of the pre-dawn dark, was that he had lost himself somewhere along the way, long before the beam fell. The man he was now was a hollowed-out echo of the man who had once believed in something more than just making a buck. The ultimate irony was that he almost died proving a point no one had asked him to make. What had he become? He looked at his bandaged hand, felt the ache in his side, and the answer was a bitter pill. He had become a failure not because of what he lost, but because of what he had never truly valued. The scent of antiseptic and stale coffee hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the familiar tang of sawdust and sweat he lived by. He tried to shift, a dull throb in his side flaring into a sharp, insistent pain. A low grunt escaped him unbidden, and a flicker of shame crossed his face even in the sterile quiet. Garrett, the man who never complained, couldn't even manage a silent ache anymore. He looked down at his right hand, bandaged thick, an angry purple bruise peeking out from beneath the gauze on his knuckles. That hand, calloused and strong, the one that had built his business, laid brick, framed houses, signed contracts. Now it just lay there, useless. The memory of the crane cable groaning, the sudden, sickening lurch, the shout of timber. That was too late, the world tipping sideways in a flash of blinding light and a roar like a freight train. It played back in his mind in grainy, slow motion. Dust, so much dust, filling his lungs, blurring his vision, followed by the crushing weight, not quite on him, but beside him, pinning his leg, slamming his chest against a steel beam. The air had been knocked out of him, leaving him gasping, clawing at the non-existent breath. Then the sharp, metallic taste of blood in his mouth. He remembered thinking, this is it? After all that, it ends like this. The sheer, pathetic irony of it, dying on a job site, just like any other grunt, after years of believing he was building something bigger. He'd woken up in the ER, doctors and nurses like blurry angels, their words distant, clinical. Broken ribs, severe contusions, lucky to be alive, Mr. Garrett. Lucky. The word felt like a punch to the gut. What was lucky about this? His business was a ghost of its former self, dwindling to nothing, the paperwork for its final dissolution sitting on a lawyer's desk, untouched for weeks. Sarah, his wife for 25 years, had moved out 3 months ago, saying his ambition had finally eaten him alive, leaving nothing left for her or anyone else. Her voice had been quiet but firm, the kind of quiet that meant there was no coming back. He'd watched her drive away, packed car, a lifetime of memories dissolving in her rearview mirror, and he hadn't said a word. He told himself it was her choice, that he was busy, that he had bigger things to worry about. He had convinced himself that the pain in his chest was just indigestion, not a gaping hole where his heart used to be. But now, lying here, the physical pain was undeniable. His body was broken, and with that brokenness, the carefully constructed walls around his heart had finally crumbled. The business gone, the marriage gone, his body nearly gone, the sheer overwhelming totality of it all pressed down on him heavier than any falling beam. It wasn't just physical pain, it was the raw, emotional wreckage of a life built on sand. The hospital room was a lonely echo chamber, especially at 3 in the morning. The rhythmic beep of a machine somewhere down the hall was the only company Garrett had. 3 in the morning, that witching hour where every regret felt amplified, every mistake replayed in vivid, brutal detail. He felt a tear, hot and unexpected, trace a path down his temple, pooling in his ear. He didn't wipe it away. What a fool he'd been. He lay there, not moving. Couldn't move much anyway. The pain meds were a dull throb, but the other pain, the one in his gut that was sharp and clear. He thought about the beam, how close it had come. A fraction different, and that would have been it. Lights out. And what would have been left? A pile of debts, a divorced wife, kids who called but didn't really know him anymore, and a house full of empty rooms. The ghost of a dream he'd chased right into the ground, leaving a crater where his life used to be. Enough. The word wasn't spoken. It just formed in the deepest, grimiest part of his soul, a quiet detonation that vibrated through his damaged bones. Enough running. Enough pretending that busy meant important, that providing meant loving. Enough chasing things that didn't matter while letting everything that did slip through his fingers. The battle, when it came, wasn't fought with fists or ambition, but in the quiet, sterile confines of his hospital room. Days blurred into a monotony of pain meds, bad coffee, and the endless beeping of machines. Physically, he was mending, slow as winter ice. But inside, where the real damage lay, the war was just beginning. His kids, Emily and David, they came. Sarah, too. He'd always been a man of few words, especially with them. Guarded, distant. Now, lying there, a broken thing, he couldn't put up the walls. He was vulnerable, and it was a terror he'd never known. He found himself listening to them, truly listening, not just waiting for his turn to speak or to offer a fix or to manage the conversation, but hearing the tremor in Emily's voice when she talked about college debt, the quiet frustration in David's eyes about his dead-end job. It was excruciating. Every fiber of his old self screamed to bark orders, to offer solutions, to put on his impenetrable "I got this" mask, but he couldn't. He was helpless. And in that helplessness, a strange thing happened. He was forced to receive. To accept the juice box Sarah brought, the careful adjustments of his pillows by David, the quiet presence of his kids just sitting there, not needing him to be anything other than what he was, a man who almost died. The familiar pull to strategize, to scheme, to think about rebuilding the business, to get back on top, it was immense. The old Garrett whispered in his ear, a persistent, sneering voice. "You're a failure if you don't get back on top. You're nothing without your work, without your money." This was the first brutal battle. He had to actively, consciously tell that voice to shut up. He had to choose, moment by agonizing moment, to just be, to not grasp, not control, not plan, just to breathe. The day they finally let him go home, the quiet house amplified his aloneness. Every shadow seemed to hang heavy with memory, the ghost of a shared laugh, the echo of an argument, the silence where a family used to be. Old habits like phantom limbs twitched. He'd reach for his phone, ready to scroll through old business contacts, or check financial news, or even just lose himself in the endless static of the internet. Each time he'd stop. He'd catch himself. Enough. He started small. Instead of turning on the TV, he'd sit on the worn armchair by the window, watching the street. The mailman, kids on bikes. The way the afternoon sun hit the oak tree across the way. He'd listen to the birds he'd never noticed before, feel the sun on his face. It was simple, agonizingly slow, and sometimes it felt like torture. The quiet was deafening. His mind, accustomed to the roar of ambition, was unsettled by the stillness. His body was still stiff, movement slow and painful. Getting dressed was an ordeal. Making a simple meal felt like climbing a mountain, each ache a reminder of how close he'd come, but also, paradoxically, of the second chance he'd been given. About 3 weeks after the accident, the dam almost broke. He tried to call Sarah, not about the kids, not about bills, but about them. About the wreckage, about the quiet regrets. The conversation was stiff. Old patterns like stubborn weeds emerged. He felt himself trying to explain, to justify, to control the narrative, to fix it like he fixed everything else. She was polite, distant, the wall between them as solid as ever. The phone clicked silent, and he felt a familiar, crushing weight of failure descend. "See," whispered the old demon louder this time, "you mess everything up. Just go back to what you know. Money, control. At least you were good at that. At least you knew how to be that man." He sat there, staring at the phone, the cheap plastic cold in his palm. For a long, dangerous moment, he almost caved. His hand twitched, reaching for the old laptop he kept tucked away, a ghost of his former life. He could almost feel the familiar hum of the hard drive, the quickening pulse of a new venture, a new chase. He could plunge back into the familiar, numbing obsession, the one that made him feel alive, powerful, in control. His hands, calloused and now scarred from the accident, clenched into fists. He felt the phantom pain of the falling beam, the ache in his ribs, the dull throb where the steel had kissed his flesh. He remembered the cold, fluorescent light of the hospital room, the quiet, earth-shattering detonation of the word. Enough. He wouldn't. Not this time. Instead, he walked outside. Stood on his worn patch of lawn, the grass long overdue for a trim. He looked at his house, not as a symbol of past aspirations or current financial struggles, but just his home, a simple structure under a vast sky. He started working on the small things, fixing a loose fence board, the wood rough beneath his fingertips, mending a squeaky hinge on the shed door, not for profit, not to prove anything, not for anyone else, just to be present in the act of quiet repair. Emily called later that week just to chat. He found himself asking her about her dreams, not just her grades, not just the practicalities of college. He really listened, heard the excitement in her voice, felt the flicker of connection. He could feel the old fear of vulnerability, a lump in his throat, but he pushed through it, let it sit there. It wasn't easy. Every single day was a choice. Every morning the bed was warm, the world outside full of demands, and the temptation to retreat, to fall back into old patterns, was a powerful current. Every evening he felt exhausted, not just physically from the slow mend, but emotionally from the constant conscious effort. He was actively, painstakingly unlearning a lifetime of habits, of self-deception. It was harder than any construction job he'd ever tackled, harder than pouring concrete in a blizzard, harder than climbing a crane in a gale. But somewhere deep down, the feeling of enough had started to sprout a tiny, stubborn root, pushing through the cracked concrete of his old life. Then one afternoon, maybe 3 weeks after the accident, Garrett found himself on his porch swing, the one he'd bought years ago but rarely used. Sun was dipping, painting the clouds in shades of orange and purple. A couple of kids were laughing down the street, their voices carrying on the cooling air. He wasn't thinking about bills or what he should be doing or the next project. He was just watching, feeling the slight breeze on his face. He noticed the way the light hit the leaves on the maple tree, how the shadows stretched long and thin across his lawn. It wasn't a revelation, not a sudden flash of insight. It was quieter than that. It was like a long-held breath finally escaping. A knot he hadn't known was there loosening in his chest. A moment of simple, unburdened peace. David showed up that Saturday, unannounced, just to help him finish fixing the back fence. Garrett had expected the usual, quick, almost transactional visit. But as they worked, side by side, measuring and nailing, a comfortable silence settled between them. Garrett didn't lecture. He didn't tell David how he should be saving money or what he should be doing with his life. He just worked. And then he found himself asking David about his new car, about the routes he took for work, about the music he listened to. Simple questions. And he listened. Really listened, not just waiting for his turn to speak, but absorbing David's words, the slight smile that played on his son's lips when he talked about cruising with the windows down. When they finished, David looked at him, a little hesitant. "Thanks, Dad. That was good." Garrett just nodded, a genuine, easy smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah, son, it was. At work, things started to shift too." Old Garrett would have been the first to bark orders, to get agitated when a delivery was late, to push everyone harder. But one morning, when the concrete truck was stuck in traffic for an hour, Garrett surprised himself. He didn't explode. He just walked over to the crew, leaned against a stack of lumber, and started telling a story about a ridiculous mishap on a job site back in the day, making them laugh. They looked at him, a little bewildered, then relaxed. "We'll wait." he said, shrugging. "Doesn't make the concrete set any faster if we stew about it." The crew boss, Mike, a man Garrett had worked with for 15 years, clapped him on the shoulder. "All right, Garrett, what they put in your coffee this morning?" Garrett just grunted, but there was a light in his eye that hadn't been there before. He started eating lunch with the crew, something he rarely did before, preferring to eat alone, going over plans in his head. Now he'd sit, listen to their banter, even crack a dry joke or two. He found himself asking a younger guy, fresh out of trade school, about his family, about his aspirations. He wasn't trying to mentor, not really, just connecting, human to human. And he realized something profound. These small, everyday connections, the shared laughter, the understanding nods, were like little pockets of warmth in the grind of the day. They fueled him in a way chasing the next dollar never had. Weeks turned into months. The lines on Garrett's face were still there, etched by years of sun and worry, but the tension around his eyes seemed to have softened. His posture was still solid, unwavering, but there was a subtle ease in his movements. He still woke up early, the habit ingrained, but now he didn't immediately jump out of bed. He'd lie there for a few minutes, just breathing, feeling the morning quiet, sometimes even catching a glimpse of the sunrise through his bedroom window. He'd never really seen the sunrise before, not truly. It had always just been the start of another day to conquer. Now it was a moment of beauty, a quiet gift. He picked up a new routine. After work, instead of crashing on the couch or drowning himself in old financial statements, he'd go for a walk around the neighborhood. Not a power walk, not to burn calories, but just to walk. To see the dogs being walked, the kids playing in their yards, the rhythm of his community. He started noticing the flowers in his neighbors' gardens, the way the light changed as dusk settled. He even exchanged a few pleasantries with Mrs. Henderson down the street, a woman he'd lived next to for 20 years and barely knew beyond a wave. One Saturday, Sarah called. Not about the kids, not about bills, but just to ask how he was. It was a strange call, less guarded than any they'd had in years. He told her honestly that he was doing all right, that he'd been thinking about a lot of things. He even apologized, a quiet, simple apology for the man he'd been, for chasing something that had cost them so much. There was a long pause on her end. Then softly, "Garrett, I'm glad to hear that. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something real. It was a crack in the old wall, a bridge starting to form where only rubble had been." He knew it wouldn't be easy, that the past couldn't be erased, but he felt a lightness he hadn't known was possible. A deep sense of peace, knowing he'd tried, truly. He wasn't a different man in the sense that he'd shed his skin. He was still Garrett, the construction worker, the man with calloused hands and a quiet demeanor. But he saw the world through new eyes. The drive to prove himself had faded, replaced by a quiet contentment. The fear of vulnerability, while not gone, no longer controlled him. He still worked hard, but the frantic, desperate energy was gone, replaced by a steady, purposeful rhythm. He still had bills, still had challenges, but they didn't consume him. They were just part of the landscape, not the entire horizon. He had found a richness not in what he accumulated, but in what he simply was. At work, the change wasn't announced with a speech. It was in the small things. Old man Henderson, who'd been on the crew longer than Garrett had been alive, noticed it first. Garrett, instead of just barking a direction, would sometimes put his own shoulder into moving a particularly heavy sheet of plywood. He'd catch the eye of the new kid struggling with a knot, not with irritation, but with a silent offer to show him. He started listening, really listening, to the lunch break chatter about busted transmissions and kids, soccer games, not just tuning it out while he ate his sandwich. The crew felt it, a subtle shift in the air around him. The tension in his shoulders seemed to have finally eased. The work itself, once a frantic race, became a steady, purposeful craft again. He still moved with a foreman's authority, but now there was a different kind of strength behind it, one that wasn't about demanding, but about being present. His children noticed it too. Emily, home from college for a weekend, found him in the garage, not fixing something, but just sitting on his old toolbox, looking out the open door. He didn't jump up, didn't immediately ask about her grades. Instead, he asked about her thoughts, about the big questions she was grappling with in her classes. And he listened. He didn't interrupt with advice or solutions, just listened, truly. David, usually tight-lipped, started to share details about his own work, his frustrations with a difficult boss. Garrett didn't offer immediate fixes. He shared a quiet story from his own early days, a reflection, not a lesson. He was simply there. With Sarah, the calls became a quiet rhythm, less about old wounds and more about new shared moments. They talked about the garden, about old neighbors, about anything but the past, And yet, by creating that new space, they were slowly, carefully laying new foundations. It wasn't a romantic reconciliation, not really. It was something deeper, something honest. The gnawing emptiness that had driven him for so long had receded like a tide. He still remembered the feeling of that hospital bed, the stark white ceiling, the terror of almost losing it all. But now it wasn't a weight, it was a compass. It pointed him towards the things he'd ignored. The simple satisfaction of a well-cooked meal, the quiet peace of watching a sunset from his porch, the warmth of genuine laughter from his kids. He found himself walking around his modest home, not seeing the repairs needed, but the memories woven into the slightly worn furniture, the comfort of his own space. He wasn't chasing a phantom anymore. He was just living. One evening, David was talking about his dreams of starting his own small remodeling business, about needing to save every penny. Garrett leaned back in his worn armchair, the TV muted, the quiet hum of the house filling the space. "I chased money and success like they were the finish line, son," he started, his voice a low rumble. "Thought if I just had enough, built enough, controlled enough, I'd finally be something. A winner, I guess." He looked at his calloused hands, then at his son. "Turns out all that chasing just broke everything that mattered. Broke my business, broke my marriage, nearly broke me in that hospital bed." He paused, a deep breath filling his chest. When you're flat on your back, staring at a hospital ceiling, staring at death, you realize what's truly rich. The people who visit you, the sunrise you almost missed, the quiet peace in your own head when the doctors finally leave you alone. He shook his head slowly. "The rest, just noise, loud, empty noise. It's about showing up, son, for yourself, for the people who matter. Not just with your wallet, but with your whole self. Don't wait for rock bottom to figure that out." And that's the thing about a man who finally learns to put down the heavy burdens he's been carrying, burdens he once thought were his strength. He doesn't become a different man overnight, no. He just becomes the man he was always meant to be, stripped of the false gold and the empty promises. He becomes rich, not in what he accumulates, but in what he finds he truly needs. Because some